Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Saturday, November 16th, 2024. You are watching the latest episode of The Rundown. It's episode 8 of my weekly podcast where I talk about all things in the video game industry, from drama to controversy to sometimes good things, although that's quite sparingly as of late, and some of these seedy undergoings happening behind the scenes in the industry that we'll probably end up talking about today as well. And for today's episode, I got quite a bit. Everything from Bioware's internal investigation when it comes to leaks that have been happening about information in regards to Dragon Age: The Veilguard. Then I also have an article here by IGN that talks about the AAA gaming industry, or the AAA industry as a whole, and how the bubble may have finally burst. Got to go into some details about that, and perhaps a little bit of a diatribe of my own in regards to that subject. Also, I have news about, the the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, that's coming after Steam for its quote-unquote proliferation of hatred and extremism on the Steam platform. We'll talk a bit about that as well. Then I got some other news that kind of broke today that's still kind of raw, but we'll kind of watch some of the video that I have prepared for this episode and talk a little bit about some of the subjects here, because I think it is important to talk about and paint a pretty significant picture of just how deep a lot of this rot in the industry runs, and the kind of thing that I've been talking about for quite some time now, and for the reason why so many content creators, YouTubers, the list goes on, have been speaking out against this shit, because it's all starting to bubble to the surface. And yeah, it's a bit of a problem, so we'll get into that as well. I see you in the chat there, Raiku. All right, yeah, without further, actually, keep forgetting to do this for this episode, for these episodes. Obviously, I'm your host, Corrupt Ronin. Thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you do enjoy the show and you want to see more like it, I appreciate that. That goes a long way. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into this thing. So, first up, I do want to talk about some of the information that's been coming out from Bioware as well. I actually have a video here from one Smash JT that kind of talks about the internal investigation that's happening at Bioware over the developers or whistleblowers that have been reaching out to content creators, talking about what's been going on with the studio as a whole, and potentially why Dragon Age ended up being what it is, and it ain't pretty. But I'll play the video first, and then I'll expound upon my thoughts on this subject, because I've already seen the video, but for those who haven't seen it, we'll go ahead and dive into some of those topics. So here we go. Hopefully you guys can hear it too. I don't know if I had the audio set up for this. hopefully the audio set up for this, but I can't make any guarantees. Let's see. That should all be there. Hopefully it works. I'm sure it's not too loud on top of that. Oh, that's not getting picked up at all. I'll have to fix that. Hold on. This always happens when I'm trying to do a show. Come on. And what's weird is that it says it's there, but it's not actually there. On the window, this appears too. Wonderful. Let me try this one more time.
Giving me some additional stories of what's transpiring now since I made that video from within Bioware, and how it's all started to come crashing down. The individual who shared this information also spoke about the recent video that I talked about Bioware's internal challenges, and he expressed gratitude for the accuracy depicting the studio's current issues from an insider at Bioware. And while I cannot share the full specific details of the email from this person for obvious reasons, I want to give you guys the snippets that I could pull out that I feel like do not implicate this person whatsoever, but at the same time do still give you some sort of idea of what's going on behind the scenes at Bioware, and why I feel like this is kind of a house of cards that's about to come crumbling down. The second whistleblower stated in his email to me, as someone working at, I'm blocking out the specific area, I can confirm that the issues you highlighted are widespread, and many studios are facing the same challenges. Unfortunately, it's not...
Now, let me stop that there. In regards to the challenges that this particular person is referring to, a lot of it stems from, well, a lot of the things we talked about in regards to, let's say, Ubisoft, for example, of the studios hiring these employees that are activists more so than game developers, and are well, unfortunately, more focused on pushing their particular message or activism within the games more so than making good games. And because of that, a lot of people that are veterans within these studios are kind of either getting pushed out or moved to the side to bring these people in so they can work on these games. And in many cases, especially in Bioware's case, when it comes to Dragon Age, there has been a lot of that going on. Take, for example, one of the lead developers on the game and one of the lead writers of the game, and I'm going to paint a picture here for you guys. One of the lead writers on Dragon Age The Veilguard was formerly a writer for Kotaku. Now, that may not sound like a big deal in itself, but let me explain further. This was the same Kotaku writer that came after Atlas and Nintendo when they put in a Persona 5 character in the latest Smash game and the Persona's theme song in there, which they claimed one of the lyrics in the theme song said retarded instead of retorted, based on the fact that the pronunciation of the word was a little bit skewed because the singer in that song is not native English. To which Nintendo and Atlas came in and clarified and said that's not what they said. They said retorted instead of retarded. And it took a long time for this particular writer to retract their statements and apologize for making assumptions about something they didn't know about. Like I said, people in this industry do not fail downward, they fail upward. Somehow, this same person ended up at BioWare at a lead writing position on Dragon Age The Veilguard. How the fuck does that happen? But let's continue.
Just BioWare that's dealing with pressure from certain vocal groups within the workplace. Your video hit the mark so well that it inadvertently shared details which could potentially identify the individual who provided you with the information.
Now, I kind of want to stop there because I have seen quite a few of his videos in regards to people that have been reaching out to them. And while it seems like he didn't necessarily provide enough information for these people to be found out within the studio, I do think it is kind of maybe detrimental when the whole idea is to be as vague as possible, but then you keep using, well, as much as we joke about it, you use specific pronouns for these individuals like he and him, for example, and that could be a big problem if these individuals who have reached out to you have very important positions within the company, and there may not be a lot of them within the company, which kind of narrows down the ability to be able to search who this is if they already know what gender the person is. That kind of doesn't help. But anyways, let's continue.
I want to stop there real quick and say I have confirmed with the initial whistleblower that I already know does work at BioWare. I've checked them out and I know who they are. That person told me that they're safe, everything's good, they appreciated my video, and they didn't have any concerns with what I divulged in that initial take. But even still, there are concerns moving forward that even if that person's cool with it and everything's fine.
Also, to clarify that last point I made as well, in some videos, he also clarified that these people have very important positions within the company and have been working there for an exceeding number of years, upwards from 10 to 15 years at BioWare. So those kinds of details may not sound like much on paper, but when you top that on top of the fact that you've also kind of used pronouns to describe whether or not this person is male or female, it does kind of narrow down any potential search they might have when trying to find out who these individuals are. Hopefully they don't get found out and lose their jobs, but, it doesn't exactly help.
That BioWare might still try to find something in that email to flush this guy out, because that's the current environment at BioWare. No one's safe. I've seen firsthand how, and he tells a brief story here, and he says the brief story that he referenced, which was up for only a few hours, even received support from some of the higher-ups in the LGBTQ plus community from within the company. So with this part of the email that he sent me, he gives me a story of what took place after I made that video internally at BioWare, where they were freaking out to the point of trying to find who this insider was that leaked it, which should tell you everything you need to know about how truthful everything I said was. Because let's be honest, if it was being made up or fabricated, don't you think BioWare wouldn't be worried about it? Or they'd come out with a statement being like, yeah, that's not true. We don't prioritize positions for the LGBTQ plus trans people. We don't use DEI here. We make sure we hire based off of merit. Yeah, the merit. That's what we do at BioWare. This leaker confirmed that the issues that I highlighted in the initial video are widespread across the companies under EA, with many studios facing similar pressures from vocal groups within the workplace. This now second whistleblower noted two main concerns with their lengthy email to me. The first one being that the video I made was so accurate that it could potentially have risked exposing the identity of the first whistleblower, which led to a very real-life situation where hostility came from the... I'm not going to talk about the specific story there because it might give some information away, where some employees called for retribution against the original whistleblower.
Now, you can imagine that is... some would call that being almost cult-like behavior. Especially if you're that much on the mark when it comes to identifying some of the issues that have plagued this particular company over the past few years and how long this game has been in development. We're talking practically 10 years at this point. This game has been in development. We're close to it. And it is unfortunate because this kind of goes, this lends credence to the whole narrative that people are kind of being silenced within the company as they are afraid of losing their jobs by reaching out and speaking their minds about how much they're against a lot of this shit. And for a lot of people, like, these jobs are the livelihood. And if they lose them, then, you know, they're kind of out on their ass. And even worse, because the industry is kind of overrun with this particular rot, as I would like to call it. Once you lose your job at one studio, and the information about why you lost that job gets out, the chances of you being hired at other studios decreases significantly, as you may potentially end up on a blacklist. So you could be done, period, for the entire industry should information like this get out there. And you have to ask yourself, is that the kind of workplace you want to foster? Is this the kind of industry that you want to support, where people can't express perhaps opposing views on something in regards to what the design of a game or direction of a game, without having to put their whole career on the line because they said something that might have offended a overly sensitive group of people?
That's how these pack of groupthink weirdos approach life. Like, if you are not with them, they need to exterminate you from the company. Because, yeah, sure, diversity is great, as long as you don't have diversity of thought. And like I said, I spoke to that original whistleblower after publishing that initial video, and he put me at ease that no one there knows it was him, and at this time, he should be safe. But the reaction from the fallout of that video speaks volumes for the atmosphere at BioWare right now. They're far more concerned with silencing any kind of whistleblower than actually addressing the issues within the company. It reminds me so much of Firewalk Studios before that ultimately collapsed itself, when I had a whistleblower contact me directly from Firewalk and was like, here's everything that's happening. You have to address people by their preferred pronouns. You have to address people by the professor. You have to sit through these weirdo meetings with everyone that you don't ideologically agree with, but you still need to pretend you do, or else you're out of the company.
Now, the whole professor thing was a kind of a story that he broke a while back in regards to Firewalk Studios and Concord. Apparently, one of the heads of the studio demanded that everyone address them as the professor. And for a while there, it was kind of like, okay, this is just insider information. We don't quite know if this is true or false. But then the game comes out, and people were able to see the credits of the game, and lo and behold, in those credits, there was one person who was addressed as Professor Brown. So much so that you had to be addressed as Professor in the credits of your game, a game that ultimately failed and shut down an entire studio.
And all these other things that, if you do not completely virtue signal and align with all of them, that not only will you be written up and brought to HR, but potentially being cut from the company completely, because they don't care about actual real diversity. They want groupthink. They want a cult. And much like with Firewalk Studios, this is the same direction I see BioWare going right now. He then went in to highlight the broader issue of positive toxicity at BioWare, where raising any kind of legitimate concern has now led to fear of backlash and being labeled as negative or harmful. This kind of culture, as I've talked about plenty.
I can't try to hit pause at that point. It wasn't working. See, that also lends credence to the idea of this culture of what we now call toxic positivity in these studios, where no one is allowed to speak up against something about whatever direction a game is going in, because that will be seen as negative or harmful against the studio at large. So you end up in these cases like a Concord, for example, where had they been able to find these issues out in advance, I think the game might have had a better shot of surviving from the day that it was shown or revealed at the Sony State of Play, where it was very clear that no one had any interest in that game. And there is an IGN article that I'm going to talk about in the next bit of news here that kind of goes into a little bit of this topic as well, but also showcases that even IGN still doesn't quite understand the reason why Concord failed, or they do, but they don't want to believe that that is part of the reason why that game failed. But anyways, if you want to see the rest of that video, I'll probably have a link to that particular video in the description of this podcast on YouTube. That's from the content creator Smash JT, and he's kind of been on a tear and exposing a lot of this shit in the industry as well. And him along with a lot of other content creators that have been kind of on the tear doing this shit as well. So while a lot of his videos, he tends to come to conclusions that are kind of iffy and perhaps not as well thought out as he might thinks they are. Overall, I think he does pretty good work in exposing a lot of this shit. And it's definitely, as you can tell, it's definitely sending some shockwaves in a lot of these studios when insiders are reaching out to him saying like, yo, what you're talking about is kind of hitting the nail on the head here a bit. And it's kind of causing some very upset people within these studios that do not like it or want to shut it down completely. Like I imagine, because there was a bit of a talk, and he mentions later on in the video about the sales of the game and how internally the game has effectively, or I think it was in a different video, he talks about how the game has officially crossed the 1 million sales mark. This was confirmed by an insider at the company, and which is kind of not surprising that it was going to cross that mark at some point, although it's been well over 2 weeks since the game came out, so the time frame in which this would be important is kind of past. But don't be surprised if you see any news from Bioware or from Dragon Age or even from Access Media about how the game has finally crossed 1 million sales. And they'll try to use it as a means to, quote unquote, own the chuds, for example. Again, this whole thing is completely stupid, but whatever. It is what it is. But it's at a point now where it doesn't really matter all that much. And even if it does cross that 1 million sales mark, you still haven't made your money back on the amount of money you spent on this game. It's been rumored that the game costs anywhere between $200 and $300 million. And if that's the case, just for you to break even, and I talked about this before on the streams in which I was playing the game, in order for this game to break even, it would have to sell anywhere between 4 and 5 million copies just to break even. And while it's very possible that the game will reach this mark, it ain't going to reach it over the course of this year, or the next year, or the year after that. It's going to take quite some time. While to the fact that the game has already run its course and people have lost interest in the amount of money they would need to basically offset those costs, it's come and gone. And it's already clear that they've pulled a lot of these people off of Dragon Age to work on the new Mass Effect, because as was confirmed recently, is that the Veilguard is not going to have any DLC. Which is a weird thing for Bioware, a company who is known for creating quite well-crafted DLC for most of its games. We're talking anything from Mass Effect 2 to Dragon Age: The Inquisition and Mass Effect 3. Like, they're known for crafting DLC for their games. And this is like their first game outside of, let's say, Anthem, for example, but that game crashed and burned, as we all know. And Mass Effect Andromeda, which also crashed and burned, that didn't have any DLC. So, I said it before that Bioware is not what it used to be. And I said it before that this was probably a change that was quite evident since the end of, let's say, Mass Effect 3, for example, that the Bioware that we came to know and love is no longer there. And this just solidifies that fact. Where if you have to silence people who have opposing viewpoints are saying like, yo, I don't think this idea is going to work with the general public, and you get silenced because, oh, you're harmful, or you're so negative, or perhaps you're a bigot, and you get all these kinds of labels that basically shut you down and put you at risk of losing your job. And it's like, why would you want to foster that kind of industry? Riker in the chat says, AAA space is falling apart if you put that much in and your result is that. Or you could put the 100 million in and get back to Baldur's Gate 3. Exactly. And a lot of people will try, when it comes to the whole Baldur's Gate 3 thing as well, a lot of people on, well, I try not to make this podcast or any of my content political, but to illustrate a picture here, where a lot of people on a particular side of the political aisle will try to hold up Baldur's Gate 3 as this idea of, see, look, this game is what you would call woke, quote unquote, and that everybody loves this game and it did really well. Keep in mind, this is the singular example they always go back to disprove the quote unquote chuds. But the thing with Baldur's Gate 3 is that game is a true role-playing game or RPG based on a fundamental premise. While there are characters in the game that do have components of what people would call woke, the part of that game, the particular important part of that game, I guess you could say, is that you can choose the characters you want in your party. You have complete and total control over who you want and don't want in your party. If you don't like a character, you don't have to recruit them. If you really don't like them, shit, you can even kill them off if you want to. Totally up to you. Where that stuff, with all the stuff in the game that you would consider woke, you don't have to engage with any of that. You can play your game as straight as you want to. That is the definition of a true role-playing game. Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't a success because of the woke elements in it. Baldur's Gate 3 was a success because of the amount of choices it gave players overall. And that's not to say that Baldur's Gate was some sort of crazy anomaly that put Larian Studios on the map. No, Larian Studios had successes before Baldur's Gate 3. Has everybody forgotten Divinity Original Sin 2? That game won a lot of Game of the Year awards well before Baldur's Gate 3. So Larian already had quite a pedigree under their belt before Baldur's Gate 3. BG3 was just the culmination of all that talent coming ahead to this one specific game. And Riker says Baldur's Gate has hot characters also, which is true, and a lot of characters that people actually liked. There's this whole thing where they like release stats about like the characters that people romanced the most. And I could go on a whole diatribe that kind of shows how people may not care all that much about your particular, like, I guess, woke characters, so to speak. And they might just kind of opt for what most people would call normalcy. But that's a whole diatribe that I could go on to, but I don't have no time for that at all. But I could definitely talk about that shit if I wanted to. Either way, overall, yeah, like Dragon Age was not necessarily a success for Bioware. And it's very clear that it wasn't. And while they might celebrate the amount of sales the game had, or the fact that it crossed 100 million, crossed 1 million sales overall, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and might even be enough to keep BioWare afloat overall, I can't imagine that EA is too proud of how this game performed. And I can't imagine the overall mindset that's going on with the new Mass Effect, seeing as how they're going full steam ahead on that from this point forward. And there's a part of me that's kind of selfish and was hoping that BioWare wouldn't shut down before they made the new Mass Effect. But now, seeing what Dragon Age is and having played through a lot of it so far, and even met the character that everyone was talking about and making memes of, and I can already see why a lot of people do not like this character. Why a lot of people do not like this character, it makes me very concerned about the future of Mass Effect as a whole, and perhaps maybe I don't want this, but I'll be keeping my eye out in the future, and we'll see how it goes. And I can't imagine that the sales of the game won't continue to increase as time goes on. Like, the holidays are coming up, you got Black Friday, you got Christmas coming up, and I'm sure the sales will probably increase when, let's say, the fall sale for Steam pops up at some point in time. That'll probably increase sales as well. But I imagine it will not be enough to offset the cost that this game had for its development. Like, when you consider that a game like Spider-Man 2, which has the Marvel brand behind it, and costs what is supposedly, based off the leaks, around $350 million to develop, and even that couldn't break even, which also led to some layoffs at Insomniac Games, then it's pretty obvious that your 1 million sales is nowhere near enough to offset the cost for a game like Dragon Age: The Veilguard and its damn near 10-year development cycle. It's just not enough. I can expect that there'll be more whistleblowers to reach out to content creators as time goes on, because I think, like I mentioned many months ago, it is very clear that the pendulum is swinging or has swung in the opposite direction, and it swung pretty fucking hard. And I imagine this will probably end up giving a lot of developers who chose to remain silent out of fear of losing their jobs the confidence to speak up about what's been going on at these studios and how it's been kind of a net negative overall for the industry. So even if these whistleblowers were to get found out at BioWare, it's not going to stop people from reaching out to these content creators to tell them what's really going on behind the scenes. But anyways, on the topic of the AAA gaming failure that we're starting to see as of late, there was an IGN article that came out this week that I kind of want to go into and talk about a little bit here as well. So I'll probably read a little bit of this and then talk about specific points that they make in the article. And while this article kind of completely misses the fact of why Concord had such a, well, I shouldn't say such a, had a terrible start out of the gate, they do make some good points about what's been going on in the AAA space. So here we go. Let me full screen that and take you guys over to the page. Also, yeah, thanks for the heads up, guys, about the tag still being for Dragon Age. Thank you for changing that, by the way. Appreciate that. I see you, chat. Don't worry. I appreciate you guys looking out for me. Let me see. Oh, here we go. So this article from IGN is called "The Blockbuster Games Bubble Has Burst. The AAA industry survival may depend on smaller scale, creatively diverse games." Which, honestly, they're not wrong. But let's read a little bit about it before we get into this. It says the video game industry is currently in the thralls of a paradox. For players, it could be argued we're in one of the greatest times for gaming. The incredible breadth of choice across consoles, handhelds, PCs, made ever more accessible through gaming subscription services like Xbox Game Pass, PlayStation Plus. But from an industry perspective, things could not be more dire. More and more studios seem to be closing. Original IPs are being scrapped in development, and vast legions of game developers, programmers, artists, and animators have been cut loose. To put it simply, the AAA video game bubble has finally burst. Now, for me, I kind of take a little bit of an issue with this particular paragraph because while the AAA bubble has indeed burst, I would not say that it burst recently. I would argue that it burst years ago, and we're only just now seeing the rippling effects of that now. And for me, that bubble burst over 6 years ago. Let's continue. Across the past 2 years, over 23,000 jobs in the video game industry were lost, with a staggering 6,000 in January 2024 alone. Over 30 video game development studios have ceased operations, including Arcane Austin, Volition, and more recently, Firewalk Studios. There's a video from, I believe it is Short Fat Otaku, is his name on YouTube. He actually talked to a former Volition developer about why the new Saints Row crashed and burned the way it did and ultimately shut down Volition as a studio. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well if I can find that again, but that's a pretty good video, and he kind of proves that the person who he talked to about this did indeed work at Volition before it was shut down. Continuing on. What's worse is this trend shows signs of continuing rather than diminishing. How did we get here? Some analysts have concluded these closures and redundancies are a necessary remedy to companies having overextended themselves in response to inflated demand in the market due to the COVID-19 pandemic. What's undeniably a factor, I believe the truth lies in other long-term gestating issues within the AAA project bubble. Riker says it's pretty obvious why that would have failed. Yeah, so I mean, part of this could definitely could probably be pointed back to with the pandemic that happened, over 4 years ago at this point. But I do think that we're relying too heavily on that being the particular issue. A lot of this particular issue kind of lends back to the idea of what I like to call the Hollywood-ification of video games, and I guess I'll kind of go into a bit of a diatribe on that a little bit later, but it's more than just the COVID-19 pandemic that has kind of led to the overinflated costs of these video games as of late. And while most of that could be rested at the the feet of corporations and, you know, big budget corporations and studios that have been chasing a certain dream. Another part of that can be placed back on us, the gamers, for our constant demand for bigger and better games every single year. And I'll get into that a bit later. But at a certain point in this article, IGN also makes the erroneous claim that the reason why Concord failed is because, he says it down here, but live service titles require investment of not only money, but time to find their audience, neither of which was afforded to Firewalk Studios' Concord. The reason why I take issue with this particular statement is not because it's not necessarily true. It is true, but it was true at the beginning of the live service idea for video games. We're talking back when Destiny was a thing, when Warframe was coming out, because nobody really knew what live service games were or what they could be back then. They were taking a risk back then. And because they took that risk, they needed time for their games to find an audience that could get into them. And they were afforded that time. Today, that method no longer works because there's so much competition out there, right? There's a lot of live service games that have found their audience, and people only have so much time to dedicate to a game to play it. And considering that Concord costs anywhere between $200 and $400 million, you can't handle sitting there and putting a game out there and being like, all right, well, just piss it away at the wind out there and see if it finds an audience. Like that, you have to worry about things like server costs, and you have to continue to keep paying employees to add the updates and new content to the game. There is no feasible way for that game to keep that to hang out on the vine and somehow find its life with an audience that likely doesn't exist. When the game was announced, no one cared. When the game had a closed beta, no one cared. When the game had an open beta, no one cared. When the game came out, no one cared. No one had any interest in this game. It wasn't going to find an audience because the audience didn't exist. And there is no way you had, like, let's be real here. So while Sony certainly has a lot of money, billions, in fact, billions is not infinite. You don't just keep throwing money at a project that's hemorrhaging money and hope that one day it's going to eventually work out. It's not going to happen. Sony knew better and pulled the plug on the game because they knew the audience just wasn't there and it wasn't going to find it. But they'll continue to keep talking about how it's the fact that Sony never gave the game the time it needed to find what it needed. Raku says Microsoft thought they took the biggest L with Redfall. Yeah, that was another live service game that crashed and burned. And we made fun of them for that too. But with Concord has eclipsed that for the kind of failure that game is. It is crazy. And again, this goes back into the same shit I talked about during the Bioware topic of, you know, people just not listening to the feedback within the studio saying like, yo, this idea is not going to work. People don't like this. People aren't going to want this. And you spend years, lots of years, sometimes even decades working on these games only for them to come out and not find the audience because the audience isn't there, just like the people who are trying to tell you. It's kind of crazy. Now, what does all this mean? And again, this is, if you guys want to read this article, I'll have a link to it as well in the description if you guys want to check out what the rest of IGN has to say about this, because they're not entirely wrong in their assessment of why the AAA gaming bubble has burst. Their reasoning for why some games have failed may be a bit flawed because they're avoiding the particularly important issue of, hey, these characters are not appealing. These characters are not appealing. You have to have characters that resonate with people. They don't have to represent people, because it's been proven time and time again that representation in video games is just not that important to people. Hell, there are even studies out there where people have said, yo, the gamers have spoken. They said that representation, not that important. Turns out, not everyone is a fucking narcissist that has to see themselves in every game. I'm totally fine and okay with playing games with characters that look nothing like me. A lot of my favorite games are Japanese games. Well, their protagonists, definitely not black. Like it says, just make good games. I want to have fun. Exactly. That's all there is to it. People just want to play good games and have a good time. This whole representation shit is a farce. And there's a lot of people within these studios that are pushing this idea, and it is a complete and total fabrication. Because it's not about the games themselves and making games for a market that enjoys them. It's about them pushing games and having developers make games specifically for them and people like them. And it turns out There's not a lot of people out there like them. But this is the part where I kind of go into my little diatribe that I have here about the Hollywood-ification of video games, which I believe ultimately is what led to the AAA gaming bubble burst. So I do have a bit of a written note for this whole thing, and it's a bit long, but even with it being as long as it is, I still feel like I haven't covered all my bases. But you guys tell me if you would like to see me make a dedicated video on this subject when I'm done. Anyways, so like I said, the IGN article isn't far off the mark. Sans the woke bullshit in video games that many of us have obviously gotten quite tired of. But to me, the AAA gaming bubble burst happened years ago. Some of my favorite games of the past 5 years have been indie games. And while I still enjoy the AAA game every now and then, they haven't exactly been a priority for me. Not the way they used to, at least. The IGN article talks about how budgets have ballooned astronomically over the past 5 years alone, though this could be tracked all the way back to the course of the past 20, in my opinion. In what I like to call the Hollywood-ification of video games. Some would argue that this began way back in the late 80s and early 90s with games like Dragon's Lair and Night Trap. If you don't know what those games are like the epitome of the whole, like, oh, this is you watch what happens on the screen, and then you pick the path that the player or the particular character on screen goes. Although I would argue, while people tend to call those games quote unquote, I would argue that those aren't quite video games in themselves, but there's a lot of love for what those things were at the time. But again, if anybody wants to make the argument that it goes all the way back that far, that's fine. I just don't consider them to be video games in the traditional sense. Anyway, where this whole thing, in my opinion, really took off can be traced all the way back to 1998 with a little game called Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid kind of flipped the industry upside down. It changed the way we thought about games and what they could be, for what we believed to be the better. But was it really for the better? Since then, the industry has been constantly chasing the true movie-like experience. The advancement in graphics tech has benefited from making games visually incredible. Photorealistic even. But what was the first thing we did when we finally reached an apex? We started cramming in Hollywood actors because, well, if the environments look believable, then we probably need believable people as well. In the 30 plus years of my gaming life, I can count on maybe one hand how many times I've heard other gamers even, say that they want Hollywood actors in their games. On one hand, maybe even a couple of fingers, to be honest with you. And yet here we are. And when you look at how much these actors get paid for in films, you can imagine them not getting paid that much less for acting in video games. While video games certainly don't have them having, constantly on-screen roles all the time, and even in most cases, they'll have different people doing the motion capture for them with the faces of the actors themselves. So while they may not be getting paid as much as they would for a movie, you can't imagine they're getting paid that much less for what they do. Then you couple this with the fact that you have tons of artists to make these worlds look believable, realistic, alive. Because for some reason, at least in the industry's mind, every game needs to be open world now. And this is one of those things that I kind of rest at the feet of gamers as well, because for some reason we keep demanding that all these games be open world, while completely being oblivious to the increased costs that comes with development. So back in the day, when you used to have a game that would have, let's say, maybe 5 artists working on it because it was a smaller scale game and didn't really need that much staff to work on it, you didn't have a game with almost continent-sized content, or an entire world that's almost the size of a continent, and now you go from 5 artists to 50, to 100 artists, to 1,000 artists, because you're obviously going to want to get that game out in a reasonable time frame. Bigger games take more time to develop. And if you don't want to be in a case of a Dragon Age or a Concord, where your game takes 10 years to develop, and you want your game to reach an audience before, let's say, a genre dies out and people lose interest in that said genre, well, you got to have the people to bring that thing to the finish line. But the more people you hire to do this, that increased development costs. And all this Not for the chase of making a good video game, but for the chase of making an entire universe. A believable world that people can lose themselves in. Or at least as close to that as you can get. And you wonder why the costs and budgets are so astronomically high. And the customers that eat that cost when game prices go up. And even worse, when you consider that some economic analysts in the industry say that even with the $70 price tag for a lot of these games, that price tag is still too low. There was an article talking to the CEO of Take-Two, which owns 2K Games and Rockstar, talking about how there's a potential for Grand Theft Auto 6 to come out and be even more expensive than the video games that we play today. But that $70 price tag, it might not be the standard for too much longer. So I don't know, get prepared for $120 games in the future? The chase for the cinematic experience has led to a chase of realism, believability, which leads to inflated studios and development costs. The chase for huge open worlds leads to lengthy development schedules, which can result in even larger budgets, and worse, your game launches in a saturated or dead genre, and now you have a hyper expensive game that is dead in the water. And don't even get me started about how this Hollywood chase also stifles, innovation and creativity. Because if you're always chasing the realism for video games and the fact that you have to have your words be believable and have the people look real, then what are you doing about creativity? If everything looks the same and everything looks like real life, then how was that not boring? Well, one of the main reasons why people play video games in the first place is to get away from that real life. You want to know why people get upset about real life politics in video games? It's because they're trying to get away from that shit in their video games. They're trying to get away from that shit in their movies. And you can't seem to figure out why that's failing. Why your films are crashing, why your video games are crashing, and even worse, when you take the time to make these movies that are dedicated to a specific audience that isn't there, you go out of your way saying that if people don't like said thing, then they don't have to watch it. They don't have to play it. You insult perhaps the biggest demographic for your product, and then are surprised when people aren't buying your games and the sales numbers aren't being reached and your games are failing and your studios are shutting down and people are getting laid off. When you're seeing increased development costs for games because everybody wants games to be open world now for some fucking reason, I don't know why, which is part of the reason why I rest part of this solely at the feet of gamers as well. And you have games that are costing anywhere between $400 million. There was even a case where an anonymous developer in this article said that one of their games in a franchise cost what was it, $660 million? I think it's in this article. Let me see if it's here. I think I saw it somewhere in this article, I think. Yeah, here we go. This article says, it's far from just Call of Duty facing ballooning costs. And the same CMA reported an anonymous publisher admits the development cost of one of its franchises reached $660 million, with $550 million of marketing costs on top, making that a $1.2 billion video game. When your development costs are reaching that high, do you really think it's a good idea to insult an entire demographic, the predominant demographic in the industry, and thinking that your game is going to sell? Anyways, I've kind of gone on my diatribe a little bit too long, and I only have so much time for this episode. I'm trying to keep it within the hour time frame, but I'm probably going to end up going a bit over that with this one. But I don't know. These thoughts are kind of a little unfiltered, but I mean, if you guys want me to go, because I have a lot more to talk about in regards to this subject as a whole. I can go into much further detail. So like I said, after hearing this, if you would like to hear me expound on this further and go into greater detail about why I believe the Hollywood-ification of video games has ultimately been its downfall, especially in the AAA space, or particularly in the AAA space, just let me know. I can make an entire video dedicated to that specific subject. But anyways, so yeah, the bubble has burst, and it didn't burst just recently. It burst a long time ago, and it was bound to happen because this chase for, the cinematic experience has been a net negative overall. And I kind of saw that coming because as the development costs increase and technology increase, you're going to eat those costs. And unfortunately, when those costs get higher, the customer ends up eating the brunt of that because now we have to pay more to keep these studios afloat. All for something that many of us didn't even ask for. Anyways, on to our next topic. Let's go over here. Remember that whole thing I said about about insulting gamers and how that can lead to, decreased sales of video games. Well, guess what? There was some news that came out recently from PC Gamer, but we're going to go to the source of this particular article, where the ADL says that Steam powered hate, the top gaming site rife with extremism and anti-Semitism. Oh yeah, we're going there, boys. So according to this ADL article, they claim that Steam is rife with extremism and anti-Semitism, which I do believe that you can most certainly find this stuff on Steam if you look for it. And you can most certainly find this stuff in any social website if you look for it. They say, on August 12th, 2024, an 18-year-old donned a skull mask, blah, blah, blah. Well, it kind of goes into the whole thing about the one of the attacks that happened in Turkey. I'm not going to talk too much about that for fear of this possibly getting flagged on, let's say, YouTube, for example. But they kind of go into details about one of the things that happened in Turkey back in August 2024, August of this year. And they kind of go into their key findings on their searches about the extremism and anti-Semitism remarks. And when looking over this stuff and their methodology, I found that while you can certainly find this stuff on this platform if you search for it, but the way they present this stuff is in a way that kind of says that Steam is galvanizing these people into becoming extremists, and that the platform is just overflowing with hateful and anti-Semitic rhetoric. But when you break down the stats of their findings, it tells a bit of a different story. And I'll tell you why. So in their key findings, they say here 1.83 million unique pieces of extremist or hateful content, including explicitly anti-Semitic symbols like the Happy Merchant and Nazi imagery like the Totenkopf and the swastika. But then they even talk about how the use of, let's go down. Well, it begins here. But you go down to the top extremist or hateful symbols on Steam, and Pepe the Frog is the most used quote unquote extremist symbol on Steam. Now, the reason why this lends me to the idea of this entire study being flawed is that while they mention up here that they found instances of the frog being donned in, let's say, Nazi imagery, they have deemed that because of this being the case, that the frog itself is an extremist symbol. But the truth be told is that most people who use the frog don't even know the origins of said frog, or even realize that people have used the frog in the past as an extremist symbol. In fact, I would argue that most people today that use the frog do not use it as an extremist symbol in any way, shape, or form. And they don't specify the particular uses that Pepe has been in these specific instances on Steam. They just looked for whether or not the frog was being used. Which is why, when compared to, let's say, the swastika symbol, for example, in the stat here, the Pepe the Frog symbol eclipses that in its amount of use, 54.6%. So when you don't necessarily specify what people are using it for, then of course that number is going to eclipse everything else. Because there's a lot of people that use that frog as a meme for other things. So that's where part of the flaw of this study comes into play. But then there's the second part of the flaw in this study. Well, up here they say there's been 1.83 instances of these particular hateful symbols being used, or unique pieces of these symbols being used. That sounds like a lot. 1.83 million? Sounds like a lot. However, when you consider the fact that Steam is home to 132 million active users, that 1.83 million is a drop in the fucking bucket. Actually quite small. Especially when the point of your whole article is to indicate the idea that this anti-Semitism and hatred is just all over the platform. Which is what they're indicating here. Now, I think anybody will agree that hateful rhetoric and anti-Semitism is bad overall. And that in a perfect world, it shouldn't be on any platform. And I agree. But unfortunately, when your platform is home to millions upon millions of users, it can be very difficult to accurately moderate that stuff. In fact, their own tools show just how difficult it is to moderate that stuff, because the things they would have to look for are very specific. And in their study, in the tools that they used, they were not that specific. Yes, anyone can tell you that the swastika is a terrible symbol. But in many cases, the people that post the swastika symbol, like the copy pastas, they're not always doing it because they believe in what the swastika symbol stands for. They're doing it to troll. For the same reason why people will post ASCII art symbols of penises in Twitch chat. That's why the methodology of these studies is very flawed. It tends to paint a lot of this stuff with broad strokes. I just haven't seen a penis in chat in a long time. I know people have moved on to different things when it comes to posting for copy pastas in chat. But for the internet as a whole, it all comes down to people just posting shit for the sake of posting shit. They see someone post an ASCII art penis in chat and they copy that and post it too, because the chat's wild right now. Everyone's going crazy. Let me just spam a bunch of random shit in the chat because I can. Oh, someone posted an ASCII swastika in the chat? Well, I'm going to copy and paste that and post it too. Shit's funny, right? And they kind of show some of that stuff as well as some of the images as we go further down. Like they show a lot of the, some of the anti-Semitic shit. And they show the copy pasted, swastikas and stuff like that, which, again, you look at things like Twitch chat and you've probably seen some of this shit posted before. So it can be hard to determine whether or not these are actually being used for the sole purpose of being anti-Semitic or even being hateful, especially in large forums of people where there's a lot of people out that are just doing it to troll and nothing more. Now they do have a few instances of like specific people out there. Let's say, sorry about the sniffles, by the way, guys. My allergies have been kicking my ass as of late today, unfortunately, and they're starting to come to a head now. They used one instance of, I believe, this particular person here, who, attacked a bunch of people in a synagogue in Germany in 2019. And how they had a Steam account, which they replaced their profile image with someone who also did the same thing and how much they worshipped him. But the whole idea there was that this person just had a Steam account. And I imagine a lot of these people out there who have done terrible things out in the world also have Steam accounts of their own. Like it's not far-fetched to believe that these people had accounts on different platforms where they bought things or played video games. Like that's like at some point these are regular everyday people just like you and me. Up until they did the nefarious, heinous shit that they did. But to sit there and say that the whole platform is proliferating these ideas because these people existed on it or because they've posted these symbols is kind of strange. And I can't really understand the particular motivation into doing this from the ADL when it's clear the methodology is flawed and the things they looked for were not as specific as they should have been. So I'm trying to figure out what the point was for this in the first place. Is to justify their continued existence to the government, for example? Because while they say they're a non-governmental organization, I can't imagine the money they're getting to continue as a corporation or a business is coming from nowhere. Was it for the simple fact of the rather constant attempts within this industry and the government as a whole to continue to paint gamers as extremists, violent extremists, anti-Semitic? Especially in the cases of, let's say, a Twitch, for example, where a lot of people there's been a significant increase in that particular rhetoric on the platform, with Twitch doing nothing to stop it. When you have some of your top creators interviewing actual terrorists on the platform and receiving no repercussions for it, it's hard to say. But do not be surprised when you continue to see stuff like this going into the future of people trying to paint gamers with broad strokes because they happen to find a bunch of people on a platform who happen to be gamers, but also happen to be violent extremists at the same time. It's not that gamers are necessarily promoting these people to be this way. These people already exist. If the games didn't exist, it's not going to change anything. Like you look at some of the groups on Steam and these particular groups that are for the sole purpose of doing that, they have very limited amounts of people on them. They said they found 7,824 groups who use at least one particularly extremist or hateful symbol copy paste on a keyboard on the platform or keyboard on the platform. It's so like the methodology of finding this stuff is so vague. but they're using this to bolster the numbers of how much this stuff happens. It's the inability to look into the nuance of this stuff to find out the truth of what's going on. And sometimes it's deliberate to simply bolster the numbers of something to justify a governmental investigation into what's going on. And that's what the whole purpose of this whole thing is. This exists for the sole purpose of getting the government into it to find out what's going on. And then it begins the question of, how much do you really want the government to come down on your video games and your platforms, where now everything you do on the platform is monitored at all times and you have no privacy? Everything from the messages you send on Steam to the games you purchase, all monitored. Question is, would you like that for yourselves in the future? And a lot of things like these are dedicated for the sole purpose of trying to make that happen. Because if you look into this, while they are right that there is you can make a case for hateful rhetoric being seen on any platform, the question is how prolific is it? And in many cases, not that much, especially in this case. Like, these numbers sound like a lot, but in comparison to to Steam as a whole, as a platform, and the amount of people using the platform, these numbers are actually quite small. We're talking 1.2% of the platform. Not as prolific as they would like to claim it is. Yes, it's a problem, but not the huge problem they're trying to make it out to be. Next bit of news here. I guess because I'm kind of short on time, we're probably going to skip all the way to the last bit of this one. The last little bit here. I was going to talk about Assassin's Creed. Well, maybe I'll talk about Assassin's Creed. We'll talk about Assassin's Creed, actually. I'll take that back. So there was a leak that came out recently detailing Assassin's Creed Shadows Battle Pass. And this happened on Reddit a few days ago, in fact. But the post on Reddit was ultimately removed by Ubisoft from a DMCA claim. So you can't, I'm sure the images are still out there somewhere, but unfortunately I can't show that out of risk of also getting issued a DMCA takedown by Ubisoft. So we'll just have to go with what the article is saying here. Anyways, this is from Eurogamer. It says, leaked Assassin's Creed Shadow images have surfaced that appear to show a selection of free Battle Pass rewards for Ubisoft's upcoming blockbuster. Assassin's Creed has never offered a Battle Pass before, and Ubisoft is yet to announce any details on how this officially on how this will work. Still, data mine content appears to suggest players will be able to complete daily missions from within the game's new Animus hub to progress a Battle Pass with 20 free tiers and receive cosmetic items. Ubisoft now appears to be scrubbing images from social media, including Reddit. That's the whole DMCA takedown stuff. Cosmetic items include the kind of optional visual items that Assassin's Creed has regularly offered for free and for sale in the past, including character costumes, weapon skins, and new looks for your mount. Assassin's Creed has long hosted daily and weekly missions too. As with most Ubisoft games, these timed challenges and rewards are found with the publisher's Ubisoft Connect app. Now, obviously this is a problem because why the hell do you need a battle pass in a single player game? And honestly, this kind of goes back to the whole thing I said earlier about ballooned development costs and developers being desperate to try to make that money back somehow. This could be a case of Ubisoft not being confident in the sales of the game, so they're trying to make that money up through different methods. Which, I don't know. I mean, when it comes to Assassin's Creed, I mean, the game isn't as popular as it used to be, but it still sells, let's say, relatively well for the most part. And while a lot of people are kind of, this game has been marred in controversy, and for good reason, mind you, and we've talked about this ad nauseum in the past, something tells me this game still might sell relatively okay. This could be the inverse of the Streisand effect, because the Streisand effect is not politically aligned with any faction. The Streisand effect is just a neutral thing, where a thing that's marred in controversy gets more attention and more eyes on it, and probably even more popularity based on the controversy alone. So what we're seeing here could have the inverse effect of making sure that Assassin's Creed Shadows ends up being one of the most purchased games in Assassin's Creed history because of the Streisand effect. We'll see what happens, but something tells me this game is not going to do as bad as people are either hoping or thinking it will. Riker says, not like I was going to get this, but I said it before. I won't be the one picking up the cost. Yeah, a lot of this stuff when it comes to these high development cost games, it ends up being us, the customers, that end up eating the cost, not the studios, us. There was an example of this, and I recall back in, because I played Assassin's Creed Odyssey many, many years ago. And this comes down to the trust that you would have to have in a studio. But one of the complaints that people had with Assassin's Creed Odyssey is that the game was overly grindy, and that some of the quests required you to be certain levels in a game that you wouldn't reach until, let's say, after many, many hours of playing. But you could circumvent this if you put real money down and bought the microtransaction XP boost the game had. That would cut your grind time in half to reach certain levels to get through the game. And in many cases, people recommended buying that XP boost because if not, the game was a grindy mess. Which then begins the question of whether or not Ubisoft did that on purpose to push people into buying the XP increase microtransaction. And it's not like you can trust the developers to be honest about that, or the publisher for that matter. So why would you trust them about this? Now, we don't really have the details about whether or not Assassin's Creed Shadows is going to include the RPG elements within it. And who knows? It might still include that because Assassin's Creed Mirage also included that shit too. Even though that game still kind of went back to its roots in terms of what an Assassin's Creed game is, it still had some of that shit in it. So I imagine that Shadows might still have some of that shit in it as well. And perhaps be even more incentivized to do it, considering how much time and money went into this game and how the developers are kind of scared now that the game might not do so hot because of the controversy behind it. But yeah, a battle pass in a single player game. That's where we're at now. This is the result of ballooned development costs as a byproduct of what I call, once again, the Hollywood-ification of video games. We're not going to spend too much time on that. Let me go ahead and go to the to the next thing I want to talk about. Again, there's still so much I want to talk about today's episode, and I'm already running over time. So let's get to the last bit here. Remember that thing I talked about in regards to a lot of people basically pushing lies to developers in the industry to pass off a certain agenda, to get certain agendas pushed in video games, whether it be the woke shit, like trans and gay characters, so on and so forth. And for a lot of people, you get a lot of pushback saying that, oh, that's not true. This stuff is happening naturally in the industry. The industry is just becoming naturally diverse. According to one Alyssa Mercante, formerly at Kotaku, now at Rolling Stone. But as some news broke today from a YouTuber, it shows that perhaps this quote-unquote natural diversity isn't quite as natural as it might appear to be.
Yearly Games Award ceremony that barely broke.
Okay, let me go ahead and slow down because I was trying to watch this fast for the episode. All right.
It's so lame, dude. We don't need it. But now, let's move on to the next story here, which involves Witcher 3's
Now, this is from the YouTuber Endymion, who has kind of been bricking a lot of this shit as well. He's also been another one of the YouTubers that a lot of insiders have been reaching out to in regards to the subject of what's happening in the industry. But this particular video is kind of cogent in the fact that it explains a lot of what's going on and just how deep this rot runs in the industry and how much people take advantage of it, not for the sole purpose of being virtuous, but for the sole purpose of, well, as many people call it, grifting in the industry. They tend to call these YouTubers grifters, but what you're about to see here is the real grift in the industry.
Parent company CD Projekt Red. So last month, I exposed a major grifting company called Gaming Magazine. In case you don't remember, this gaming magazine was founded to charge gaming publishers and partners upwards of $100,000 plus to become official sponsors for their yearly Games Awards ceremony that barely broke over 1,000 views last year when it debuted on YouTube. And no, I'm not kidding. And then they call us the grifters. Goddamn, I gotta start making up award ceremony shows and just selling sponsors for insane amounts of money myself. Anyway, the gaming magazine is tied to a lot of the usual people that you've come to find attached to many different games that have also been ruined by DEI. For example, people like Laura Dale, who worked on Dragon Age Veilguard, is a part of this gaming magazine.
This is the individual I talked about that tried to get Atlas and Nintendo in trouble for the inclusion of the song in Smash Brothers, where they made the claim that they said retarded when the word was retorted. This is that individual. And they worked on Dragon Age, by the way.
Grift group. They also used to write for Kotaku until they were forced to step down because they were writing articles that damaged Kotaku's reputation, if you can believe that even happening. You may not notice who all these faces on this picture on screen here are. The guy here on the right, his name is Alex Battaglia. I might have said that wrong.
Battaglia.
But
That's
anyways,
the
he works
Digital
at
Foundry guy.
Foundry, and you have seen him a ton probably on there too. He was also, in case you remember, very vocal about how much he finds Stellar Blade to be overtly sexual and have unrealistic body proportions.
Do you think the character model was actually like very distracting in not a good way? Because like with the camera angles chosen, it just felt like this game seems like a game that came out in like 002 in terms of its, you know, like character design. It's like a
He's become kind of a meme about this since he made those claims about Stellar Blade when the game was first shown off years ago. Everybody kind of refers back to this particular moment that he talked about in that DF Direct, because he shit on Stellar Blade for being quote unquote unrealistic and a product of a not so great time, so to speak.
a bit old and not flattering, I don't think, for a modern audience. In comparison to something like Forspoken.
Even though we all...
Oh yeah, he also compared it to Forspoken, saying that Forspoken was much more realistic and believable compared to Stellar Blade. You tell me which game survived. You tell me which game between Forspoken and Stellar Blade survived.
I think that's very stupid. Like I said, this gaming magazine grifts like crazy in the industry and demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars from studios to support them while they make content for quite literally nobody at all. Here's the YouTube channel attached to this so-called official magazine, which you can see in real time has horrific numbers that don't paint the picture that this is some sort of organization that is resonating with anyone besides small fringe minority groups. And one of the people a part of Gaming Magazine is this person here named Cypher. Don't harass this person, by the way. Let's just analyze what's going on here. So friend of the channel, Savvy, who honestly, I just want to congratulate because she has...
Also, yeah, I've been following her as well, and she's been doing some really good work behind the scenes of digging up this shit and exposing it. Like, you know that meme of the guy who has like the board behind him with all the threads and attachments and all the pictures, like the crazy guy who's doing all that shit? Like, she is that guy. This Madam Savvy, she is that guy. She is the one connecting all the threads, finding out different businesses that are attached to others. She's kind of been exposing just how deep the rot in this industry has gone so far. So she's been doing really good work in that aspect.
Borderline superhuman abilities to connect dots and find information out about people unlike anyone I know. Savvy should become an FBI investigator, and no, I'm not kidding. She could probably find out who the Zodiac Killer was, as long as you gave her enough coffee and some candy as an award. It's either she's superhuman, or she's probably autistic. Probably both, let's be real. But shout out to Savvy, but she's responsible for compiling this information that I'm about to show you here, so please give her a follow on Twitter, because she does great work. So real name Tanya DePass, or Cypher as they go by online here, works for Gaming Magazine, and has many ties to companies like CD Projekt Red, as well as Bioware too. And they were welcomed into Gaming Magazine as an ambassador at one point, which, yes, if you can believe it, even a channel that gets basically no traction has ambassadors. Gaming also named Tanya or Cypher as their gaming icon winner. Wow, your own brand gave you an award. Crazy. Who could have seen that one coming? They literally did the...
That is literally the meme of Obama giving himself an award. That is what that is.
Obama meme in real life. So Cypher is this person who has openly criticized and attacked CD Projekt Red aplenty prior to the release of Cyberpunk. So let's go back to 2019, okay? Rock Paper Shotgun, a gaming website, claimed that Cyberpunk 2077 had racist stereotypes in it and was basically transphobic and all the other buzzwords that you can imagine.
Yeah, that actually did happen back then. They were trying to come after the game because of its quote-unquote poor portrayals of trans and non-white cultures, basically. And they came after it hard. And it wasn't just Rock Paper Shotgun. We're talking multiple websites are making this claim. Anything from GameSpot to Eurogamer, all this stuff. We're coming after the game because they claimed it had very poor portrayals of this stuff in the industry. Let's continue.
Cypher then, of course, took that article and weaponized it via Twitter. So here's what they said in 2019 via Twitter about all of this. Well, let's talk about hashtag Cyberpunk 2077 and this Rock Paper Shotgun article hot off the press from EA. So much to Last year, I was hype AF for this game, but in that year since, well, CDPR has just failed to keep me interested. Why? Transphobia, and now this racist BS. They then, as you can see on screen, continue to state that CDPR is transphobic, and racist, and cyberpunk is awful. They continue by quoting the Rock Paper Shotgun article while including their own thoughts where they say, at one point V, the player character, mockingly says and who are them in response to Placid's pronunciation. So we got faux AAVE. By the way, AAVE stands for African American Vernacular English. Yeah, I didn't know this was a thing either, but there you go. It's apparently a version of English that
I didn't know this was a thing either. As an African American,
so
I didn't know
slang,
this was a
basically,
thing.
I guess. But this is bad because V, the main character, talks this way at times, yet can be presented as a white person based on the player's choices. I wish I was kidding, but let's continue.
And I think I kind of remember a little bit of this too, but it wasn't necessarily, at least from what I recall, it wasn't necessarily meant as a way to make fun of the fact that he's pronouncing it the way he does, because Placide is a part of the, it's a Haitian gang in Cyberpunk. And with Haitians, obviously they come from a different country, of course, and they pronounce things a bit differently based on their, native tongue. And V was saying that as a form of sarcasm, not necessarily to simply make fun of the fact of his pronunciation. People were definitely trying to cancel it before launch. Remember, we said they were banning people outright for saying they were going to get it. Yeah, that was a thing too. Absolutely.
From the original OP, I asked Comrade T, which was a developer at CDPR, if he was concerned they weren't treating certain cultures with enough respect. The following sentence sent me because I want to know what consultants y'all got for this that have passed through just fine. Obviously, we're paying a lot of attention to representing different groups respectfully. There's always a risk. Of course, we have it in the back of our heads that we need to be careful about this. We are contacting different consultants to learn about specific groups, and our company has a variety of people with different beliefs. As for the animals, if you play through the game, you'll see that they're not mostly black people, it's mixed. Cypher got mad at this, of course, and continued by saying, it doesn't get much better because the city is supposed to be mixed. But the area shown is mostly Haitian immigrants. Apparently, we are warned that the violent black thugs will turn on us soon as the deed is done. So black folks are thugs by default, they turn on their protagonists and gun folks down with no thought.
Now, they say this considering there are multiple gangs within Cyberpunk 2077 that will gun down people without a second thought. In fact, there is a gang in the game that is far more notorious for doing so, which is known as Maelstrom, who are batshit insane, and the majority of that gang is full of white people. But you got upset because you thought it was just the black people that were animals. Keep in mind, these tweets are from 2019, so before the game came out.
But supposedly there are consultants involved. I wish I could know who, cause they should be questioned on this portrayal of black folks. I know we can't know cause NDAs, and often enough if a consultant is pulled in, it may be too late if art assets, VA work, and such has already been done, which can cause a huge delay depending on how their feedback is acted upon. CDPR had already shown they are not interested in doing better in how long it took to can that social media manager, or in co-opting a trans activist hashtag for adverts. My skepticism grew after the stereotypical way the pro-tag's partner was showing to speak, the Spanglish, and terrible way he acted. I had few hopes any other race would be treated better if they appeared in the game at all. This could have been great. I don't have much hope for it to get better or be better at launch.
Now keep in mind the amount of trash talk about this game and how they have no interest in it because of all these stereotypes that they just can't stand, and how many accusations they throw at the game for being garbage, and how the developers don't care about proper portrayals of non-white cultures and all that wonderful stuff that you tend to see in a lot of these particular circles, we'll say.
Thankfully, there's too many other things coming out the same time next year to be deeply invested in 2077. I just wish it wasn't such an expected but still disappointed reaction to most games these days. Also, save your hot takes, it's just gonna get you muted or blocked, of course it will. So as you can see in 2019, the self-proclaimed gaming consultant was really mad about Cyberpunk 2077's depiction of black people, saying that the game is dead on arrival and misuses terminology apparently and much more. Then in 2020, which is the year Cyberpunk released, Cypher's entire stance on CDPR and Cyberpunk just completely changed. As Savvy discovered, which you can see on screen here, Cypher ends up proclaiming publicly that they were sent a free gaming chair from CDPR, with Cyberpunk's name clearly labeled on the chair themselves. They even admit that they were sent this item for free by the studio. But it doesn't end there. Next, Cypher publicly displayed that CDPR even sent them a free collector's edition of Cyberpunk 2077 for the PS4
Hmm.
when the game first released, even hashtagging it, calling it a PR gift that was sent to them as a gesture of goodwill. As if that wasn't enough, they even got sent food in the form of macarons that had edible cyberpunk treats by CD Projekt Red. And they again showed this on social media as being another thank you that was sent to them, but that's not all. Here's Cypher sitting in their brand new cyberpunk chair they got sent for free, now showing off their brand new NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3090, where they say thank you to NVIDIA for sending them the latest and greatest tech to play Cyberpunk at launch. Of course, they are also suddenly a NVIDIA partner, and they hashtag Cyberpunk 2077 and all.
Wait, did he just call it NVIDIA? I was pretty sure he just called it NVIDIA. That's a new one.
All that because now they're suddenly very happy to check out the game. Of course, for free because they did not pay for any of this. Finally, we have Cypher again publicly displaying that they were also sent a Rockstar Energy Drink Cyberpunk 2077 mystery box that they got sent to open on a live stream later to promote the game. As Savvy details here in her very easy to read picture that details all of this for you to see, even in steps. Cypher of Gaming Magazine, who was very vocal about the so-called racist and transphobic depictions of characters within Cyberpunk's world, went from being bitter and hateful on Twitter, claiming that they will never check out Cyberpunk due to it not pandering and whatever else, to suddenly glazing the game prior to launch, sporting a new chair, mystery box, the collector's edition on PS4, and the game supposedly on PC to play for free too, magically, after all of these freebies were sent, along with food for God's sakes. Those claims that Cypher had against CDPR and Cyberpunk, they just magically vanished.
Now, this is not a new instance of this happening. None of this is new. In fact, there was a recent instance of somebody taking advantage of this specifically with a little game called Dragon Age: The Veilguard. The controversy surrounding the game was at an all-time high, and someone decided that, well, if everybody else is getting the game for free who identifies as part of the LGBTQ community, then perhaps maybe I should try that and see what happens. So there was a user on Twitter. I forgot. I think her name was Sophia or something like that. I'll have to pull it up again. But anyways, she reached out to Bioware and ESPR, proclaimed that she was non-binary, and requested a code for the game. And guess what? They happily gave it to her. When people say that a lot of the gaming industry is ideologically driven, and people push back saying that this is not true, can't be. You're all liars. You're all racist. You're bigots. You're transphobes. You're homophobes. Xenophobes. You're all a bunch of grifters. But then you see shit like this, and the question then becomes, who is the real grifter here? When all it takes for you to do is just identify as part of that particular part of the ideology, and you get everything. Free games, chairs, merchandise, food. Hell, at one point when the PS5 came out, there was a African-American user on Twitter who got upset because she was an African-American woman who likes video games, and it's really unfortunate that Sony couldn't give her a console, and how dare they must be racist. During the time where PlayStation 5s were very hard to come by. And guess what? Not a few days later, a mysterious package arrives, and here she has a PlayStation 5 sent directly from Sony, when everyone else is still trying to get their hands on one, waiting in long-ass queues, only for their consoles to be snatched up by scalpers and resold on the market for 3 times the price. I can say, yo, Sony, where am I? Seriously, I'm like, oh shit, I'm black? Why didn't I ask for that, right? But somehow these YouTubers and content creators exposing this shit, somehow they're the grifters. They're the grifters when you guys are out here constantly asking for free handouts from these publishers and companies and are even getting them. You had one guy who, what was his, I think it was Spawn on Me? I think his name was Khalif Adams. He was on Twitter recently talking about Dragon Age: The Veilguard, and how he was so happy that the game was out and that it was supposedly doing well. And he was like, I would love to play it, but no one has sent me a code for it. Which I'm sure he was sent a code shortly afterwards. So it's like, who are the ones that are really supporting this industry? Because these so-called access media gurus are the ones that are out there getting this shit for free. For free. And will not put their own money down or put their money where their mouth is to support these so-called studios that they claim to be for. So who are the real grifters? Let's continue, because I mean, I kind of don't want to show this entire video, but it does illustrate quite a very important picture to keep in mind.
What you're seeing there, viewer, is the direct connection between these DEI consultants like Cypher and the parasitic relationship that me and others keep pointing out to you. That these consultants, the sweet babies and such, all of them form a perfect circle where they give good gaming press as long as said companies butter them up and shower them in gifts so they can brag about it on Twitter for their mutuals to see. Is it any surprise that people who work at Digital Foundry, Bioware, CDPR, Gaming Magazine, and more are all intrinsically tied to one another in more ways than one?
How's that saying go? It's one big club and you're not in it?
But wait, of course, there's more too. In 2023, Cypher, or Tanya DePass, then publicly revealed that they were named as the chair of the governing board for Take This. In case you don't know, Take This is another gaming consultant group that, by the way, was in fear of going under just a month or two ago. And they were publicly begging for at least $80,000 from anyone to keep the consulting firm open because they weren't exactly being used as much as they would hope. Of course, they somehow managed to secure funding and will remain open for the foreseeable future. And yes, the same person who pressured CDPR into giving them free stuff, which magically then made their problems with Cyberpunk's supposed transphobia disappear once the check clears, also sits at the top of Take This, which further grifts money from gaming companies to offer their services that benefit nobody but themselves. There's also more grifting and buttering up to be shown as well. Just a bit ago, Cypher was also sent the collector's edition of Dragon Age Veilguard free of charge from EA and BioWare as well.
Surprise, surprise. I told you this shit runs deep.
That they, of course, showed again on Twitter to flex on mutuals, showing, hey, look at me. I'm getting free stuff, and you aren't, because I'm in with the right people. So why am I showing you all of this? Well, firstly, because it's laughably stupid and ridiculous for one, but also because these are the sorts of people that these gaming companies are employing and, they want them for consulting. The sorts of people whose morals and standards immediately shift or even disappear as soon as money comes flowing in and free merchandise is given to them. And this is the true face of the gaming industry. The people who claim you need to listen to them or you're racist or transphobic, they're all basically lying to you, and they can easily be bought and paid for as long as you can do it. And in reality, if I wanted Sweet Baby Inc. or Gaming Magazine to like me in the future, I just need to send them sandwiches, donuts, and maybe a free game to someone like Cypher, and on pattern recognition alone, they would no longer think that I'm evil or whatever, as long as I keep feeding them food or free items instead. This, my dear viewers, is the sort of stuff we're fighting against, me and other YouTubers and such. So when they tell you that we're the grifters, I just want you to know that the people who are ruining your games, destroying your favorite franchises, reviewing these games too, or in Digital Foundry's case, showing you how they run, which they do with the free copies they get sent by publishers to do so, all of these people, they all know each other, they work together, and publicly stand proud as one under such monikers like Gaming Magazine, which again, should remind you, have been exposed by people like Grums for charging prices like $3,000 for 2 advertising pieces on their website that gets barely any traffic, or you can promote your content on their YouTube channel as well. Who would?
Considering that, I'm like, why the hell am I not asking for that kind of money? Like, there's a lot of my videos that get way more views than theirs, and they're over here charging $100,000 for sponsorships and shit like that. Why am I not doing that? I could be getting a good payday. Some of my videos get way more views than theirs. And I'm like not even close to their size. I don't have the connections that they do. Like, evidently, if this is the kind of shit that's going on, I'm leaving a whole lot of money on the table. But then again, it probably wouldn't work considering that my particular stance on this shit doesn't quite align with theirs. Anyway, if you want to see the entirety of that video, that is the Endemion's recent video. I'll probably have a link to that in the description as well. I don't want to make this whole podcast specifically about that, but I wanted to show a lot of that in its entirety to basically illustrate the point that's been said about a lot of this shit being these particular rot that has been kind of killing the industry. America says, I was thinking it. I saw 5 videos on one of those vids, and I was like, okay, 100K? Yeah. And the crazy thing is, because considering when you look at the image there, hold on. Yeah, here we go. Image of a video that has 1.2K views over the past year, and it's already sponsored by Logitech and Streamlabs. That award show was sponsored and only ended up with 1.2 thousand views. And you know Logitech and Streamlabs didn't pay a small amount of money for that fucking thing. Shit, one of my views crossed 2,000 in just a week. I'm like, why am I not taking advantage of this shit? Why am I not taking advantage of this? This is all it takes. It's because they all have connections. It's one big club. Like, the industry is rife with this incestuous, nepotistic nonsense all throughout it. And the same people that will get upset about a game that they liked not selling well and a studio shutting down are the same people that will more than happily get that shit for free and not put down a single penny on any of the games they claim to support. They're not the ones eating the costs of rising game development. We are, the average everyday citizen. But okay, I think I've definitely run the course on this shit. This went way longer than I intended, but I felt like this video was especially important to show because it does illustrate the whole point of why people are pushing back against this shit in the first place. It kind of illustrates the point of why you see a lot of people being very disingenuous when talking about quote unquote Gamergate and what it is and why it exists. Other people saying that it solely exists as a harassment campaign of misogyny and bigotry and transphobia and everything else. Because none of them want you to dig any deeper and find out what's really going on. And the same way that ADL article we talked about was very vague and nebulous in its description of what people considered hate symbols. Because they were perhaps either too lazy or deliberately malicious in trying to find out the nuance behind that subject. Like saying the Pepe frog itself is somehow a hate symbol, when most people today use that emote and Pepe the frog is nothing more as an emote. Not even close to being associated with any form of hatred or bigotry whatsoever. That's the kind of disingenuousness you're working with when it comes to this stuff. Because it's not about being accurate or telling the truth or allowing people to come to their own conclusions about certain topics. It's about using inflammatory language, emotional language, to color a person's opinion about something long before they ever come to an opinion of their own. Because at the end of the day, it's all one big club, and we're not in it. And while I may not agree with everything that these other these other YouTubers are saying in regards to what's going on in the industry, because a lot of them don't always get it quite right, but the general premise is the same across the board. We're all fighting for the same thing. And the sole purpose is to root this shit out. And what was shown here today only gives you the tip of the iceberg of just how deep this rot runs. I am confident that it goes way deeper than this. This is a course of over 20 years of this shit happening. You got to dig through 20 years of this shit. And it's going to take a long time for this shit to be rooted out. If ever. So without further ado, I'll leave you with this. Be careful about what the access media tells you in regards to what gamers are fighting for, who they call racist, bigots, misogynists, transphobes, homophobes, xenophobes. The list goes on. Because it is very clear that their intentions are not to show people the truth about what people are asking for, what video games are. I showed you a while back that there was this claim that 50% of gamers are men and 50% of gamers are women, while at the same time, the industry itself, not but a few months ago, proved that that is not true. That the majority of gamers as a whole are still men. When Capcom released those stats from a survey that they took for their gamers, like that shattered that narrative completely. Not to say that women don't play games, they obviously do. Got plenty of friends that are female that also play video games. And even worse, one of their claims is that the predominant market for video games is the quote-unquote straight white male. But if you do any of your own research, you find that that's not true. White men are not the predominant market in video games. It's Asian men. You can thank China for that. And even worse, when we want to consider a game like Black Myth Wukong that comes out and sells over 20 million copies, but instead of celebrating a game for being what it is, a video game, and promoting Chinese culture or Chinese folklore, we tried to rally against it. The industry tried to tear that game down. It started with IGN, and every website from PC Gamer to GameSpot to Eurogamer, every time they talked about that game, they laced the article with the IGN article talking about supposed sexism at game sites. But when you break that article down into what it is, the quote-unquote sexism they were talking about wasn't even related to the studio. And the people they asked about it being sexist didn't even work at it. The people they interviewed were a bunch of random female gamers in China who just said that they didn't care for the comments. What does that have to do with the studio? But everybody ran with that article. Posted on nearly every gaming website. Fancy says claiming 50% male female is crazy. It is. Because it's not true. Like, there was some recent research that came out from I think it was Statista or something like that that showed that the predominant gamer right now in the market is the Asian male gamer. Then followed by the, I guess you say the Middle Eastern gamer. Like China or Asia is the predominant market for video games. And then following behind that, I believe, is Saudi Arabia or UAE. They're in second place. And then you have Europe, around that part of the world, that region of the world. And then you have the US, which the US spends the third most of, I should try to find that graph. But the US spends, while it is probably the smallest of the markets, it spends the most money on video games. Or not the most, but it spends a high amount of money on video games. But China as a whole spends the most money on video games, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that the United States, we'll use the U.S. as an example, considering, I mean, obviously I'm an American, but the U.S. is home to roughly 350 million people. In comparison to China, which is home to, I believe it was 1.4 billion people. Just to paint a picture of the sheer amount of, like, the gap between the amount of people between the countries. So it's pretty obvious that China would be the one, or the Asian, at least the Asian region as a whole, being the ones to spend the most money on video games, considering their population is the largest. And even then, with it being the largest population, the majority of people who play the games in that region are still male. Although if you listen to some people like one Ash Paris at The Verge, they'll make the claim that, well, Asians are white adjacent, so they may as well be considered white people. Which, in my opinion, sounds racist as fuck. But somehow she's still working there. So be careful when you hear this shit from Access Media, because it's very clear. Fancy just starts laughing. And it's like, these are the kinds of people that work for these websites. You got the Ash Parrish from The Verge. You got Paul Tassi at, Forbes? Your Jason Schreier at Bloomberg. All these people are in bed with each other. That's your video game industry today. And for some odd reason, they just can't figure out why everything is crashing and burning. Or even worse, why the gamers are finally pushing back against this shit in a much bigger way than what happened back in 2014. He says, I do notice people who try to speak up for it and protect each other races end up saying shit that ends up sounding incredibly racist. Yeah. You'll see that happens quite a lot. Anyways, all right. That's all I got for now, guys. I could go on even longer tangents about this, but I'm already way over time, and I got to stop. I got to stop myself before I catch myself going into longer tangents. So thank you all for watching. I definitely appreciate it. This one's going to be a bitch to edit, and I'll try to edit as much as I can, but I might just leave it as it is for the people to just see the raw, unfiltered thoughts of what I have currently. A lot of this shit that I'm talking about is completely off script and just straight off the top of my head. Some of you may have noticed, but we'll see how that goes. Anyways, I'll be back next week, guys. Like I said, if you guys want to hear more of my diatribe about the Hollywood-ification of video games, because like I said, I have way more thoughts on that subject, but I tried to make it a bit more terse and concise for the podcast, considering the amount of time I have. But if you guys want more information on that, just let me know, and I'll try to make a dedicated video about that specifically to get real, unfiltered thoughts on that. But yeah, that's all I got. So thank you all for watching, guys. I will see you all next week. Or perhaps I'll try to crank out smaller form videos, talk about specific subjects. We'll see how it goes, depending on how time allows. A lot going on right now. I got family that's, a lot of people are traveling. I got family all the way in Vegas right now for a cousin's wedding. I didn't go because I still have I'm still trying to, I got shows to do. I got a podcast to do. I can't be out there in Vegas doing that. I don't have my equipment there. So I ended up missing out on that to be here and do content for you guys. Because I like doing this shit. Not because you guys should be grateful, but because I like doing this shit. That's why. All right. You guys have a good one. I'm out here. Thank you all for watching. Again, if you made it this far in the video, don't forget to like and subscribe if you did like it and you do want to subscribe. And I'll catch you guys next week. I'm out this bitch. Deuces. Fade to black.